Hello everyone, more than happy to be here. I'm David Chollet, partner at Accuracy. And just to quickly introduce myself, I have 20 years of experience in financial services and with a strong background in risk management. And what I've seen over my experience, here's a change in the way to assess the risk. I mean, we started with the credit risk, then market risk, liquidity risk, and the new one, climate risk, which is at the end a huge challenge for all companies. Can we go to the next slide, please? When we talk about climate risk, we have observed the climate change. We have observed the evolution due to greenhouse gas emission. And according to this climate change, it brings this new risk that any companies have to assess. And for corporates specifically, it means that they have to change into this new reality. They need to shift their economic model. We cannot manage that you cannot measure. It means that we need to understand how to identify the climate risk, how you can assess this climate risk. First of all, I would like to come back to what we have seen over the last 15 years and this global awareness. Here, you have the different events in which we discussed and we talk about the necessary requirement of law and to advise on the climate risk. Let me just focus on one of the key milestones, which is the COP21, the Paris Agreement. And I'm not saying that because I'm French. I'm just saying that because it was the first time where we have provided a requirement. And this requirement was to limit the global warming to 2 degrees, saying that we have identified some carbon emission trajectories in order to respect this limit. Since, I would say, new regulatory responses have been provided, but I would see you next year when we will have the COP28 in Dubai, because we could expect that new regulatory changes will come. Now, if we could just focus on the definition of the climate risk. Next slide, please. For a company, when we talk about climate risk, we more widely talk about ESG. And for a company to define what is an ESG strategy is in fact 2 components, internal and external issues. Internally, it means that a company have to manage the climate risk. So it means for a company the carbon emissions, and on ESG side to define their own policies. So internally, define how you want to manage it. Externally, it's communication. How do you inform the market that you are currently changing your model in order to respect your carbon emission, in order to respect the target that you have defined for your ESG strategies. Now we are just only focused on the climate part of this definition. If we can go to the next slide, please. The Bank of England in 2015 has defined the climate risk by 3 types of risk. The first one is physical risk. It means the risk coming from, I would say, the change, some climatic event, floods, hurricane, etc. So an impact, a physical impact in an asset of a company. The second one is the transition risk, which is in fact the risk to move from your current model to a low carbon model. If you do not change your model, what should happen? Probably, you will be impacted by some tax. We're currently discussing about the carbon taxes, and for sure, it will happen some new requirement to companies. And finally, the last one, which is the risk of liability. It means that if you define some triggers, some limits that you have to respect, and you breach these limits, you could be sure that you will have some financial penalties. As of today, these three risks, I would say, the common risk that some companies have to respect. If I can go to the next slide. So, in order to define the different triggers of this risk, the COP21, as I said, has defined the limits of the global warming temperature, but at the end, they have defined some carbon emission trajectories. It was the first time that the market, I would say, provided quantitative information in order to play some scenarios. And for the CFOs, it's very important to get these assumptions in order to run their different business plan. You have to know that these trajectories have been updated recently by the ICC report. And unfortunately, we already know that it will be very hard to respect this trajectory in order to get this limit of 2 degrees provided by the COP21. Next slide, please. Next. So, the challenge for a company is to define its own strategy. We say that, in average, we need a 3-year roadmap in order to implement such strategy. And this 3-year roadmap is split in 3 key building blocks. First one is define an ESG strategy. It means review your portfolio, identify your different risk, climate risk exposure in order to mitigate this risk exposure. By defining this strategy, you will define the transition planning. It means in what you have to invest, what should be the CapEx, the OpEx of your company to respect, I would say, the mitigation action that you have defined in your strategy. Saying that, the second block is the transformation of the company, the implementation of this transition plan. And finally, when you have defined further strategy, second, the implementation, obviously you need to report to provide such information to the market or to your shareholders. If we now just focus on the transition plan. Next slide, please. The transition plan is part of your climate strategy, which is also part of the business strategy of the company. This transition plan is, in a nutshell, the definition of the different actions that you have to implement. And for a CFO, something which is very important, obviously, is to integrate these different mitigated action in your financial plans, in your business plan. But operationally and technically, what does it mean? If we go to the next slide, please. Here, you have just a summary of the way you can compute and play the different scenarios of this climate risk. As I said, we have some climate trajectories. It means we know what could be the impact in terms of carbon emissions, in terms of temperature level, and by having this information, we are now able to assess the impact in the macroeconomic indicators, such as GDP, inflation, or unemployment rate. Having these macroeconomic indicators, you then be able to, we'd say, compute the impact on your financial statements from the top line, the sales, until the bottom line, taking into account, obviously, the impact in terms of volume, but also in terms of pricing, and at the end, in terms of performance of your assets. Today, this is the main model which is used by different companies and specifically the regulated entities in order to assess such scenarios. if we go to the next slide, please. Finally, in a global view, you have the value of your company before your sustainable transition. And if you do nothing, as I said, you will have some impact coming from the transition risk, coming from the physical risk. So in any case, you will observe some value erosion. In order to, I would say, compensate this erosion, if you define a strategy in order to, we'd say, put in place some mitigation action, then you will have your value preservation. But more than that, for some actors, I mean, which want to be the best in class in terms of ESG policies, in terms of climate strategies, then you may have some value creation. And if you not believe in me, next slide, please. And just to conclude, this is how the market assesses companies who have some dedicated strategies. Just an example of the energy sectors. As you can observe, there is a huge spread in terms of share pricing between companies who have dedicated climate risk strategy and the others. And at the end, in the graphic on the bottom right, you can see that the fund, the sustainability focused funds, have better performances than the global S&P 500 index. Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, David. We've got a few questions that have come from the international audience, and the one is, look, yeah, everybody knows that they've got to embrace ESG, and it's and again, it all comes down to the role of the CFO in doing this. So, so when do you think that ESG and climate change strategy is going to begin to impact S&P and Fitch ratings for listed companies?
It's a very good question. Today, I mean, we can observe the emergence of new rating, ESG ratings, coming from S&P, Fitch, but other new informal, or I would say, new no-regulated companies. So we are in a world where we have the credit rating that everybody knows, which are necessary to do to get some money on the market. And we have these new ESG ratings. But we know that there is some current homework from this company in order to integrate the ESG rating into the global rating of the company. So at the end, even if it's not well communicated, for sure we can observe that companies who have the better ESG rating succeed to have the better spread, better funding cost on the market.
So there was a follow-up to that one as well. So so when can we actually expect the climate change and regulation issues? When can we expect regulations to begin to almost like measure the climate risk exposure of businesses?
Let me split the world in the companies in two worlds. I would say we have the regulated entities and the non-regulated entities. I mean, regulated entities are banking industry, insurance industry. I mean, the increase of the regulatory constraints, if I can call them like this, is work in progress. We have seen that there is a new constraint or new expectation from regulators. Just an example. In the banking industry, we have now a climatic risk stress test each year. It means that new requirement will come, and it will be also the case for corporates. Due to, I don't know, their carbon emission, or other, I would say, other covenants. If it would not come from regulation, it will come from the markets at the end.
Yeah, thanks. And it's very interesting to tie it into a lot of the conversations that we had yesterday. And we were talking about talent, and we were talking about the Gen Z. They actually genuinely want to know what climate risk strategies companies are adopting before they even think of coming in for an interview. So, so thanks for your time today, David. We're tight on time, so we're done now. We really appreciate you coming across from Paris as well and joining the conference and adding value with accuracy and getting all the CFOs to realise that this is something that's not going away for any of us. And there's a really good insight, and David will be available online to answer questions as well.